morning. It is really great, Austin. I appreciate that song leading very much, JD. The prayer always really is a treat and an honor to me to get to spend some time with you and talk about topics that I have a little bit of experience in and am continuing to learn myself a lot about. My friend tells me of a congregation he went to work with in the 80s, but we're going to back the story back up to the 50s. And in the 50s, this church had an idea. Their idea was that they were going to have an end of the year singing. And they were going to sing in the new year. So they put everything together and started at 7 o'clock. The community found out about this singing that they were going to be doing, and the community turned out in droves. All the area churches, the community decided, hey, why don't we put this on the radio? What would be better than listening to the singing going on all the way into the new year? The local radio station had it on. It went for 5 hours from 7 o'clock to midnight. It was on December 31st, and there was not an empty seat in the house. As my friend came to the congregation in the late 80s, after a few years had passed, about 30 years, attendance was not quite what it used to be. They still did the singing for 5 hours, but the community really only had time for 3 hours of it on the radio by that time. And the seats were about half full. There were about 500 people instead of the full house that they had had in the 50s. During his time as he ministered there, he began to notice how much manpower went into the singing. How many people in the church had to work together to do the setup and the takedown and get all the preparations ready for the singing. So he decided this year, he said, I've not done a good job of thanking the people who put this thing together. So what I'm going to do is, this year I'm going to thank the folks who put the thing together. So he came to the singing and began to look around in the audience to find the people who put the thing together. He couldn't find any of his members at the singing that they put on. And so it puzzled him until he got home and realized half the congregation had rolled his yard in toilet paper while the singing was going on instead of attending the singing. They continued the event year after year with declining attendance. They moved the date, and the singing continued until it eventually could not continue because there was so little support for it. And even then, when it did not continue because it could not continue, it was a hard decision for the congregation. I want to talk to you today about church ministry programs and church ministry program assessment. Okay? To do that, I have to welcome you into the world of church programs. Now, most of you are familiar with it because you've been involved in churches. And so the things that I want to say today, I do not want to be offensive in any way. But I named them irreverent because I do feel like I'm going to be speaking a little bit of truth into a situation that's not always enjoyed to say a few things that I'm going to say today. And then I want to end with 5 relevant questions that will help you in any church setting to begin the path of thinking about church ministries and church ministry programs. Okay? Here's the first irreverent law. Nothing is more sacred than a church program. Okay? This is irreverent law number 1. Now, you say, well, what does that have to do with anything? The issue with something that becomes sacred is that it tends to no longer be able to be analyzed or critically looked at. Okay, and that's the issue. This concept of the sacred cow is where it's if you were to say something critical about something that is considered sacred, then you get in trouble for saying something critical. And the whole system of trying to determine whether or not something should be kept or let go is all based on whether or not you can look at something critically. So if you can't look at something critically and it's a sacred thing, then that's going to make it very difficult for you to ever improve your programs or your ministries at church. The value, what happens is the value of the program is viewed what we call intrinsically in the program itself. And so you can't criticize it because it's just valuable in and of itself. Okay? Now, I want to make something really clear here. This is not the same thing as being unpopular. We're talking about effectiveness, not popularity. Okay? There are some church programs that you have, and through the years that have been in churches where I've worked and served, that are very unpopular, but extremely effective. They're actually doing a good work. It's not hurting anybody. It's being very effective, but a lot of people don't like it. Okay? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about effectiveness here. Sometimes it's okay for church ministries and programs to not be effective, but to just do, for people, a few people wanting to do the right thing, they're not dragging on the church, they're not sucking resources. It's just a good thing for them to do and be involved in. Sometimes it's just simply neutral. But sometimes, and I will judge this by the audience's nodding, there are church programs that continue and suck people's energy, drain their excitement, and yet continue year after year after year after year with no end in sight. In fact, I thought I would give you some illustrations. I cannot because they will offend you. Okay? If they don't offend you, they will offend someone else. I got a list. I actually solicited a list from several ministers, and if you want those privately, I will share them with you privately. We're being recorded for YouTube and all the world to see. But if you'd like to hear them privately, I wrote them down, but then looked them over and said this would not be good for me to share because it would really hurt people. It just reinforces this idea. So I'm trying to get you to see the sort of the climate and environment in which, if you're going to go into assessing or evaluating the church ministry and program, tread carefully. Second irreverent law. Nothing is less articulated than a church program. And you say, well, what does that mean? Articulated just means clearly laid out. Okay? Clearly laid out. Virtually all assessments, anything you do in terms of trying to evaluate something and make it better, depends on whether or not you have a clarity about what the program or thing is supposed to be doing and how it's supposed to be doing it. And in our church ministry programs, this is just altogether very uncommon. Oftentimes, church ministries and programs are oral traditions that are passed down from generation to generation or from church member to church member, and can vary wildly in what they do and how they do it, depending on who is in charge or who's volunteered to serve. But if you have some clarity to a church program, if you have some very simple things, I'll tell you a couple of simple things, that if you have them, they will help you to make your church ministries and programs a little clearer and more apt to be able to be passed down to someone else in an effective way. Elderships are notoriously not strong in articulation, okay? In writing down things and getting things in clarity. You want an example of this? Go to your eldership and ask them for documentation. They will the hair on their neck will start to stand up, because it's just not common practice for us to keep documentation, okay? And to keep things in sort of a clear and paper-driven format, okay? The leaders of the programs themselves are not very used to doing this sort of documentation themselves. So it's not like it's one person's fault or another person's fault. It's just something as a community we'll have to work together to get better at. So here's some simple questions. I'll return to this in the relevant questions at the end. How many of your ministries at church have a purpose statement? We exist for this reason, or we are doing this for this reason. How many of your church ministries or programs have a target population? We serve this group, blank. Okay? And then how many of your church ministries have a set of goals, even a short set, 3 or less? Here are our goals for our program. Okay? Virtually all assessments begin with those big picture items. So if we don't have those big picture items, it makes it very hard to then go in and evaluate whether or not we're meeting our goals, whether or not we're serving our target population, and whether or not we're fulfilling our purpose as a church ministry. Okay? So those are some simple ways to get you on the right track with those things. If you ask someone who leads a church ministry for these 3 things, and they balk at you, see irreverent law number 1. This one doesn't feel as irreverent, maybe, but it actually is. It's hard to communicate and get across. And that is that ministry program leaders are volunteers and not employees. Okay? And there's just a simple reality that happens in volunteer organizations, particularly in churches. The business world will give you strategy after strategy, and will give you frustration after frustration sometimes in the church world. Okay? So if you think you're going to take the latest popular system from business and you're going to overlay it on your church, and all of a sudden you're going to be on your path to mega churchdom, it just does not work. It just doesn't work. Churches are not businesses. They're volunteer environments. And that means a few important things. Change, number 1, is slow. If you want positive change in a regular business environment, change is slow. In a volunteer environment, it is very slow. And the swapping out of personnel is not really even oftentimes a consideration in a church environment. You have to educate rather than replace. So it's a very different idea. So I want to tell you about the currency. You know what currency is, right? The money. Okay? The currency of volunteer organizations is motivation and influence, not power and authority. And if you can ever find that separation and that difference, you can be on a strong path to helping your church ministries. We have to keep our volunteer leaders motivated, influenced, organized. And we have to try to do that with a shared vision. And some of you have been in this place, and you know what I'm about to say, if your volunteer leaders are not interested in a shared vision, an overall vision for your church, and they're not allowed to participate in making decisions, then they will be more likely to try to protect their self-interests and their silos, as we sometimes call them, than they will be interested in changing for the good of the group. So if your church is headed in a direction and you need a ministry or program to change a little bit to help the church get where it needs to go, if individual volunteer leaders aren't bought into the overall direction, they're going to be much more likely to resist change and actually resist any difference and protect their own self-interest. And that's the beginning of a very bad path, because where you end up with that is a very disjointed system and a disjointed organization. Okay? One more irreverent law, and then I'll ask the questions. As sort of the culmination of all the others, ministry programs don't often change at the same pace as the communities they serve. And there's quite a few reasons for this. I think this just simply highlights for us how critically important, if we are going to have church programs, and most of your churches, I dare say every church that's represented here has church programs of some kind, or what we would call ministries in our churches. If we're going to choose to do that, then the communities that they serve are vitally important to directing what the church is doing. And we should exist at the nexus of two important ideas. The first idea being that we need to serve. That's what Jesus told us to do. We need to serve. The second idea is that communities need serving, or people need serving. We need to join at the nexus of those two things. When you get out of balance with either of those things, you'll start to see programs go awry. And you have these crazy stories of people serving a group that doesn't exist anymore, or offering things that people don't need anymore. And that's not a good place to be. We should really try to exist at the nexus of those two ideas. We need to serve because Jesus says to, and people have specific needs that need serving. The world that exists around our church building can change in days or weeks. I'm reminded of a lot of churches that are situated in a community, and then all of a sudden the neighborhood changes around them. And the church looks the same as it's looked for 50 years in terms of demographics, but all the neighborhood around them. And what's surprising a lot of times, guess what the church decides to do? Move. Isn't that fascinating? They'll move to a better location. Now, I'm not condemning churches that have made that decision. It may have been best for some churches to do that. I'm just saying, when we don't pace our ministry at the same pace as the communities they serve, we might be in danger of not being as relevant as we want to be as a church. The best ministry programs do two things. Number one, they find people's talents and they match those talents with the needs of the people that are being served. If you can find people's talents and match those talents with the needs people have, then you're on to something special. So I'll ask you these questions, and chapel will be yours. Does your church have a shared purpose or shared mission? Now, notice, I didn't say a shared purpose statement or a shared mission statement, although that's where you want to get to. If I were to ask 5 people in your congregation, what does your church good at? Or what does your church endeavor to do? What does your church feel like its particular gift is to the kingdom? Would the 5 people I asked, would they have a similar vision? Or would they have a similar idea? Okay? Mission and purpose statements help to articulate these ideas. If you guys don't have that, that might be something to think about. Again, the Bible doesn't require them, but it's something to think about. Second question, who at your church has a list of every program or ministry your church does? I love this question because this is another panic question. And then the list of who leads and is involved in those efforts. I am convinced if eldership's would compile and have this would prevent so many arguments in elders meetings about who is not doing what. Okay? And frankly, I'm a little, it really frustrates me to sit in those meetings where groups are singled out because they don't do anything. Well, guess what? They do things, but maybe they're not on your list. And that really frustrates me. So who has that list at your church? Who knows? Do these programs or ministries have their own purpose statements, target populations, and goals? So if you can get ministry leaders to think about those things and put them down on paper, wow, you'd be ahead of most of us if you could do that. Final two questions. And probably these get at the core of whether or not you're going to be sustainable in your church ministries. How do other people in the church, not just the elders, not just the leaders, how do other people in a church know what ministries they can get involved in at your church? How do they know what's available to them? How do they know where to plug in and how to get involved? And finally, how to ministry, if you got a great idea, how does it get started? And if there's something that's continuing that shouldn't be, how does it get ended? Does anybody remember the last ministry program that was ended at your church? You know? So you think about those sorts of questions, and then you go through and they kind of help you. So if you ask yourself these questions and think about these laws, I think it will help us and bless us on a path and a journey. None of us are going to get this perfectly. The nature of organizations and programs is that we're ever learning and ever growing and ever changing. But I think these few things might help us as we walk that journey. Thank you, guys.